think we'll get rolling. How does that sound, everyone? So my name's Megan Conway. I'm the president and CEO of Volunteer Canada, and it's my great pleasure to join everyone here today on this important conversation around how to harness the power of data and how to think about data as a catalyst for community change. We're really excited to be here to present this important conversation with our partners on this important project. We refer to it internally as our data-driven engagement initiative. But that just means that we're really interested in supporting how to bring to the sector key information about giving, volunteering, and participation, and how to help animate and educate and have conversations that matter about ways we can use data to support making decisions and to support really enabling us to do the kind of work we need to do in the charitable sector and social purpose sectors. So our partners are on the call here today from Imagine Canada, the Association of Fundraising Professionals of Canada, Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada, and AJA. So I want to make sure we take a moment to acknowledge that we are here on the ceded and unceded territories of the First Nations peoples from coast to coast to coast. And I want to acknowledge that the gratitude for their enabling us to be on this land. We are here as guests. I am calling from the territory of the Anishinaabe people, and I'm appreciative of all the work that they have done to steward the land and to create the place that I call home. We at Volunteer Canada are very committed to thinking about how to decolonize volunteerism, and that's not a one and done activity. It's something that we have to reflect on and commit to doing every day in our work, in our thoughts, and in our actions. So I would encourage you also to think about the lands that you're inhabiting and the ways that we can really work towards building relations with our neighbors and the work that is reconciliation work. So wanted to take a moment to really think about that as we start today's presentation in a good way. I also want to just make notice of the fact that today's presentation has been funded in part by our friends at Employment and Social Development Canada. And so we want to make a special notice here today of their important contribution to this work. Without their contribution, we wouldn't be able to bring this important conversation to you or to think about the kinds of infrastructure that are needed to really think about data as it pertains to giving and volunteering. So a special thank you to the Government of Canada for their contribution to this important project. So we wanted to just take a moment to think about the objectives that we want to cover in today's conversation. We want to really think about the importance of data-informed decision-making. And I feel like those are always such big words, but that we use data in all sorts of ways in our day-to-day life. And the better ability we have to understand data, to access data, and to utilize it in supporting key decisions, the more impactful we will be as a sector in both our individual efforts, but also collectively. We also want to explore what we internally mean as data-driven engagement. And so we want to share a little bit of our own organizational and project team understanding about data-driven engagement. Last but not least, we want to hear from some great panelists about how they interpret and utilize data to support decision-making. And we're so excited to have their expertise, their knowledge, and their backgrounds to contribute to the conversation today. And we want to be able to share a really detailed overview of the Canadian Knowledge Hub for Giving and Volunteering, and ensure that folks have the opportunity to ask questions, to share comments, and to really dig deeper into what that tool and resource will mean for you and your practice. So as we move into our conversation, I'm curious how folks think about when they think reflectively upon that concept of data-driven engagement. I'm curious what it means to you yourself in your own practice or in your organization or in the context of the work that you lead. We're really interested within this project in thinking about how we advance a data-informed movement. So we understand that the sector has faced constant change and that there's always ebbs and flows in terms of where there's available funding, what the needs are in community, and the kinds of impacts we want to make. We live and exist within a rapidly changing landscape. We know that to advance our work in really important, impactful ways, data is central and core to our ability to do that. And so to that end, we really see ourselves coming together collectively, being able to integrate and find and access meaningful data in the ways that it exists currently, and also advocate for the future ways that we might need to find and utilize data to better advance our collective efforts and share our ability to move forward together through using data to advance decision-making and to support impact. So this is my chance to hand things over to our fantastic and phenomenal project partners. And so I would love to be able to open the floor to them and ask them to share a little bit about why a data-driven movement is really important to our sector. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Imagine Canada, who's been a key partner in this project. I'll hand it over to Imagine to do a quick little introduction.
Thanks, Megan. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Barr, and I am Vice President Research at Imagine Canada. And I'm joining this meeting today from Guelph, Ontario, which is on the treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. As Megan has said, now more than ever, nonprofit leaders need access to timely, relevant, and actionable data and information so that they can make good decisions for their organization and also for obviously for the people they serve, which is ultimately why we're all here. It's equally important for government decision makers, corporate Canada, and members of the media to have access to accurate information about the nonprofit sector. And these are the reasons why personally, I believe that the data-driven engagement project is so important, and also why Imagine Canada as an organization holds that view, because making data available to organizational leaders and others to make good decisions is really one of our core reasons for being, and one of our core activities at Imagine Canada. So we, as Megan said, we've been a key supporter of this project since sort of before its inception. I think we were involved in the development of the proposal, and we're very pleased and proud to partner with Imagine with Volunteer Canada and the other partners to make this a reality. In terms of what we bring, I think probably our major contribution to this project is that we bring a deep understanding of and significant years of experience with working with really all the key sources of data about the nonprofit sector, many of which you will see on the Knowledge Hub, including, of course, the Canadian Survey, now the General Social Survey of giving, volunteering, and participating. But also the satellite account of nonprofit institutions and volunteering, and the most recent entry into the providing data on the nonprofit sector, the Canadian Survey of Business Conditions. So those are some of the data sources that are on the site, and Imagine has contributed a lot of the data analysis and the story writing for those stories. So thanks, Megan, for the opportunity to participate in this and to welcome everybody to this webinar and to the relaunch of this important site.
Thanks, Kathy. That's great. And I love your passion for data, and you and Imagine have really helped to advance key advocacy efforts across the sector that will enable better access of data all around. So thanks, Kathy, for that great introduction and your partnership in this important project. Over to Lisa and the Association for Fundraising the Association for Fundraising Professionals. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everybody. Welcome. As Megan said, my name is Lisa Davey. I'm the Vice President for the Association of Fundraising Professionals Canada, AFP Canada, and I'm joining you from the Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. The Association of Fundraising Professionals Canada is really excited about this new Knowledge Hub and how it's going to help our sector. It's a valuable resource for fundraising professionals across this country. As Kathy said, we know data is important for our sector. Understanding what the gaps are in communities enables charities to better tailor their programs. Understanding why Canadians give and what keeps them from giving helps fundraisers to be successful. In an environment of constant change, baseline for comparing trends is crucial for strategic fundraising. For many years now, AFP Canada has also been advocating for more data for our sector. The lack of data makes it much more challenging on many fronts, including for charities to fulfill and respond to the needs of communities. So while we continue this advocacy work, in the meantime, we want to make sure that what data there is, fundraisers know about. So that's why this project is so very important, not only to know about the data that exists, how to find it, but also how to get what they need from it. That's crucially important. So that's why we're excited about the Knowledge Hub. In terms of what we bring, as the largest professional fundraising association in Canada, and in fact around the world, AFP brings extensive fundraising expertise to the project, including knowledge and experience in conducting surveys and research. In our country, the AFP Foundation for Philanthropy Canada brings Canadian-focused research on our profession. So that our biggest contribution is really convening of fundraisers. And that's why we're super excited about today, because this is another opportunity to bring everybody together, and thrilled to see so many of you have taken advantage of it. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I just want to echo Lisa's comments that I am personally quite thrilled around the participation in today's webinar, because it is actually off the charts, in my opinion. There's 300, someone asked the question in the chat, there's 361 participants in today's webinar, which is really, I think, a record for me since I've been at Volunteer Canada, but it also just goes to say what can happen when you do things in collaboration with great partners. So kudos to all the partners on this project and to everyone who showed up. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Adam, who is from the Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada, to do a quick little intro of himself and VMPC's participation in this project.
Thank you, Megan. Adam James, Vice President of VMPC, the Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada. And I looked at this project, I see being data-driven as so important because volunteering is so massive, an activity that Canadians participate in every day. And you can't tell the weather across the country by looking out the window. And it's really important to myself and many other volunteer managers and professional leaders of volunteers to not just go with how we're feeling that day or how our inbox is looking, but to look at the whole picture and to know and hear and understand the trends of how Canadians are giving to their communities. We like to look at and advocate for full pictures of the value of volunteering. You might hear when people talk about their volunteers, how many they have, how many hours they give, but the story goes much deeper. So having a wealth of data information helps us to really carve out the value of having volunteers as a part of your organization and your community. And finally, that we're building an infrastructure to support volunteers across the country. And to do that well, you wouldn't want to build a bridge without some good metrics and to do some of that back end work to understand what is needed and to come up with some really clear and compelling arguments to build that bridge and to reinforce those infrastructures to support that amazing, huge investment across the country of people giving and offering their time to their communities. So at VMPC and across the country, where hundreds of leaders or volunteers are looking at their communities every day, this data-driven will just give us new resources and tools to become even better advocates for volunteering and bringing compelling reasons for people to come to the door and add to the impact that our organizations can make. So we're so excited to be a part of this. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks so much, Adam and VMPC for your participation in this project. And last but not least, I want to pass it over to Ali from Aja, who's been our great technology partner on this project, for a quick intro and hello. So over to you, Ali.
Thanks so much, Megan. Hi, my name is Ali McHugh, and I'm a project lead at Aja. We've assisted Volunteer Canada and the partners with this project and getting the Knowledge Hub up and running. As a data and tech consultancy, we grapple with a lot of the points and questions that everybody's already raised about, what does it mean to be data-driven, not just having access to data, but how do you best use it? How do you best apply it to what you work on? And what we bring to the project is also like our overall sector lens of data as infrastructure, as a common good. Echoing what Adam said about infrastructure across Canada, a lot of the work that we do is how can data function as a common good that people can use and make those better decisions that everybody has brought up. So we've contributed to the Knowledge Hub itself, and as well as with some of the kind of rollout of these activities, and we're really excited to be here and to see so many people participating today.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you also to Aja for their great support in this project. And so thank you to all of those project partners and to ESDC for their contribution to this important work. We are excited about today's conversation. And I have to say, on a personal front, I am so excited to introduce this panel of total dynamo speakers. I have a little bit of fan vibes going for each of you because you've all done such tremendous work in the sector and in really thinking about how to advance change and how to use data in really meaningful ways to do that. So thank you so much for the panelists for joining us today. I'm going to read their fantastic bios and share their backgrounds with all of you. So Natalie Napier is the research and storytelling lead at InWith Forward. And I'm really excited to hear from her because I've admired the work that InWith Forward has led for a long time. Natalie sees research and storytelling as an opportunity to redefine research relationships as much as to identify the design specs of future social supports. If systems change is about reimagining the purpose, values, relationship, policies, and practices of a system, research is a chance to live into different future possibilities, and the stories that we tell are crucial. She works mostly with thick data, and I'm excited to hear how she's going to share some of her background and experience with us today. So welcome to you, Natalie. We also have Narinder Dhami on the phone, and she is on the line, and she's the executive lead and co-founder of the New Power Labs. Narinder, over the last decade, built, designed, and scaled social ventures, including in partnership with the Boston Consulting Group. She led a venture philanthropy fund, LEAP, which many of you might be familiar with, and alongside Sandra and Joseph Rotman at the University of Toronto, Narinder was the founding executive director of RISE, a microfund for entrepreneurs with mental health and addiction challenges. She's a lecturer at Ryerson University and the University of Toronto, and she serves on multiple boards in the community, including Community Foundations of Canada, among many others. So welcome, Narinder, and we're pleased to have your expertise on the line today. And last but not least, we have Erin Spink, who is the founder of Spink Tank. Over the last 25 years, Erin Spink has gained international recognition as a writer, speaker, and trainer in volunteer engagement. Her work includes the first ever academic research quantifying the concept of volunteer engagement. She's written multiple chapters in the CCVA accreditation textbook, and she regularly contributes to the Engage Journal as a co-author of the Points of View articles. We're super excited to have Erin here to support our thinking about data and volunteer engagement most specifically. So I'm really pleased to give a warm welcome to all of our three panelists. I know they're going to share key insights today on this important topic. So without further ado, we're going to roll into our very key panel conversation. And so the first question is really about how does data play a role towards the success of your work? And I'm going to ask our first question here to I think it's Natalie who's going to answer the first question, I think. So over to you, Natalie.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Natalie Napier, and I'm actually coming to you today from Guatemala City. And I want to start by recognizing that Guatemala is a majority Mayan country where I'm very privileged to be a guest right now. Among Maya here, there is little access to the kind of knowledge that we're talking about. There's illiteracy rates among Indigenous adults of up to 33% here, and graduation rates of 1 in 5 graduation rates. But last year, the Maya achieved something quite extraordinary. And after a 40-year fight, they won a landmark human rights case against the state in recognition of their collective land rights that allow them to protect the ecosystem on which they rely from unsustainable mining practices and other things. Science is environmental activist, which for me was a reminder that knowledge is transformative when it can be shared and understood in the context of trusting alliances, and that non-professionals, even those who may be coping with tremendous challenges of structural inequalities, are partners and even leaders in change and have a right to self-determination, of course. So that's just a reflection on where I'm coming from. And so I'm the lead of research and storytelling at InWith Forward, which is a social design agency that works with regular people, community organizations, and governments to shift Canada's social welfare system from safety nets to trampolines. And that means that we co-develop alternative models of care and community roles with people who are usually left out because they're seen as needing to focus on basic material needs or difficult to work with or simply not having much to offer. And our approach to research and data is really informed by some of our core beliefs. So I want to share a couple of them with you now. We believe that hospitality, conviviality, and story sharing are powerful antidotes to human division. Am I lagging?
Only periodically, Natalie, and it's kind of unpredictable, I would say. So keep moving forward because we are hearing the bulk
Great.
of
Well,
what.
I'm watching you, so if you indicate to me, I'll stop for a sec.
Okay.
We believe that people want and ought to play a meaningful role in determining how they live their lives and how their communities flow and function. And we believe the best way to challenge the status quo is through creative action by collectively envisioning and making alternative futures tangible. So what do those beliefs have to do with research? We've really begun to talk about data as relationships. And normally, researchers are positioned as experts who collect raw data from non-researchers and afterwards analyze the data, often removing aberrations and outliers, and present conclusions for public consumption. But we see an opportunity to build a community of interest around a research topic to which our participants have some kind of connection. And we seek to build trust, mutual understanding, and solidarity, and to sense make and hopefully co-create different futures together. When we do research, we are coming into relationship with people whom we are asking to share their experiences and perspectives, and we need to be accountable to them in terms of what happens to that data. So we don't see ourselves as social innovation consultants, but as partnership builders, because we think that the perspectives and relationships driving initiatives for change will often trump other factors. And so we maintain a commitment to intellectual honesty, and we have all seen that powerful information is almost never enough to prompt bridge building, cooperation, and more just and equitable systems. So honoring people and relationships and research is a big commitment, and we continue to iterate and prototype new research approaches with these beliefs and our other values in mind. So to give you a flavor of what research and relationship can look like, I'll sneak in an example later today of a prototype called Oracle that offers a viable alternative to traditional community consultations or polls and surveys, which can tend to polarize and reduce nuance. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Natalie. I loved hearing about how your work around data has been really rooted in the beliefs and the values that your organization holds. So thank you for sharing that little tidbit around how you think about data through that lens around success. Okay, over to you, Narinder, to think about and offer some comments on the question above.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I am calling in from Treaty 13. There's two hats that I wear that I'll talk about. So one is the Sonar Foundation. So we are a private family foundation. We invest in smart, creative leaders, good ideas, transformative impact, have been around for quite a long time, so 1979, but it's really recently that I joined the family, and we've started to think about how we can expand across Canada our work, and we invest both through philanthropy, but also through capacity. And then the other hat is New Power Labs, and we're a nonprofit think tank, do tank. And it's really all about unlocking the full potential of underfunded and overlooked leaders, communities, and founders across Canada, across all diversity types. So from gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, abilities, language minorities, citizenship status, and so forth, to all types of capital. So philanthropic capital, impact capital, venture capital, traditional bank financing. And how do we think about how we truly build a Canada that's inclusive for all and enables everyone to thrive? And so we work in partnership with many others that flow capital in that process. So if I put my Sonar Foundation hat on, data is really critical, as you can imagine. We are a private family foundation, and so we have a luxury to decide on how we fund and who we fund. And data is the enabler for us to understand what is underfunded and what is overlooked, and where can we support communities across Canada. And so, and then on the other side of it, so we use a lot of data in terms of how we identify our focus areas, and there's gaps in that data, so we can talk about that maybe perhaps later on. And then on the other side, we are funding organizations. And so we're very aware of the type of data requests and the type of burden that can be created by funders and by donors. So take a very intentional approach of the type of data that we ask for, and really let the organizations that we work with and partner with drive kind of what that looks like. But it is really important because it helps us understand if we're having the effect that we think we are having, or that we think that the organizations are having, that the efforts are kind of, or which efforts are driving kind of the deepest type of impact. I mentioned earlier, we work really closely with many of the charities that we fund. And so we do, as part of that, we will work with them on data evaluation. And so how do we use data to identify, what are the activities, the approaches that are most enabling for the outcome that the organization is looking for. So at a core, data is fundamental, not only from kind of how we structure, how we define our strategy as a foundation, but also then who we partner with, and then how we work with those partners. And core, I think folks would align on this, but data is an enabler of transparency, credibility, and trust, and it just helps us do the work that we're doing. And so that's on the foundation side. And then on the New Power Lab side, it's interesting. Some of the work we do in New Power Labs about figuring out who is underfunded really enables us as a foundation, Sonar Foundation, to figure out who we are funding. And with New Power Labs, it's, we're at a really unique moment in time. I think broadly, our sector has the ambition to do better in terms of moving capital to underfunded leaders, underfunded communities. But we don't always have the tools, the approaches, the data that enable and support institutions to do that and to have the accountability around that. So, we talk a lot about data, we talk a lot about how capital flows, and we work, our research is centered around that. And so when we think about kind of the impact data, there's a what, right? The social, environmental impacts. And I think we've been talking about that for a while, and there's progress there. And then there's the who, which we don't tend, we've started to talk about that in the last few years. But we tend to have insufficient data across our country around who is being funded, regardless of what type of funding, but who is being funded. And so who are the leaders, who are the organizations we're trusting to solve issues, and how do we ensure that we are flowing capital into the areas of greatest need and to those leaders who are closest and have unique perspectives on how to solve those issues. So with New Power Labs data, we're hoping we can get a better picture of how capital flows across Canada, across diversity types, across capital types. And ultimately, as we saw with the Foundation for Black Communities, that unfunded report, this makes a really great case and opportunity to figure out how we then flow capital to these communities and then ultimately support kind of broader economic and social prosperity across the country. So my life in data is different in both hats, but I do come from an electrical engineering background, and this is, I think, such a critical part of our sector to get right. And the more we collaborate and the more we figure out how our systems combine, I think the stronger that we will be as a sector. So really excited about the rest of the conversation.
Thank you for that, Narinder. And I love hearing how data supports and informs the work that you're doing in both of the spheres of your professional life. And I also love you probing on the question of like who is missing from the data or who is benefiting from our interventions and from our approaches. So thank you for that, those insights. Okay, Erin, over to you for your reflections on this important question.
Thanks. So I'm joining you from Cambridge, Ontario, which is on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. A little bit about me: I've been in volunteer engagement for over 25 years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about data from a couple hats, like Narinder. One is as a consultant, as someone who writes and trains. I taught at the Volunteer Management Certificate Program at Conestoga College for over a decade. I teach metrics, and data to peers in volunteer engagement, but I'm also a volunteer engagement professional myself. I'm an active practitioner. And so I find that there's a very interesting connection between those things, because one of the things that I've really come to realize is that, at least for volunteer engagement professionals, we really don't talk enough about data, and yet we actually talk around it all the time. So we're talking about, tools and tactics and things like that, and not always realizing or connecting that to a lack of data. And what I find is that, why data is so important for me, and it's such a topic of passion for me, is that a lot of the way we've approached data in volunteer engagement has been fairly transactional. It's been fairly simplistic. Adam referenced like the volunteer hours and number of volunteers. Those are kind of core things that that are foundational, that most people think of, but it's so much more than that. And I really think that data is an undervalued strategic resource and driver, not only of advocacy for volunteer engagement, for the investment in volunteer engagement, but for its success. And I mean, this has been already referenced, but data is just so critical in today's world. And, people think about, if we think about somebody, applying for a volunteer role, people are experiencing today, or expecting today, the same kind of digital experience and the same use of data and cookies and all of those pieces, so that we can curate a quality experience online. They don't care if they're shopping for Nike shoes or if they're applying for a volunteer role. Their expectations are very much on par. And so we're really not utilizing a lot of the kind of common practices in data collection and, curation that the business sector has done for many years. And I also think that it's important to recognize that, volunteering doesn't exist in a bubble, right? And that ties into the, just the changing expectations of volunteers. I'll maybe just share a few quick examples of some ways that I have used data very successfully. One is around measuring my own performance or the performance of my team. And that's been used very successfully to advocate and communicate to senior leadership about the value that I'm delivering within my organization or my team is. And really to clearly articulate the work that goes into successful volunteer engagement. In volunteer engagement, it's kind of mysterious, right? People don't really know. They just see us smiling, talking to people. They don't actually often understand the work, the tools, the tactics, the strategies, and the challenges that we face in volunteer engagement. So I use data very clearly as a way to shine light on those things. So, I may track things like, which recruitment sources lead to the strongest applicants who become active volunteers, and and really segment down based on the nature of the role, the community. And for me, that's a success factor, because then instead of having to post in 10 places, because there's never been a shortage of places to post for volunteer opportunities, then I can actually just focus on those 3 ones that I know will be the most successful. I've also, used data from research to inform best practices around things like volunteer recognition. And, Volunteer Canada and others have been really, really wonderful in leading that type of information sharing. I think if we think about how to use data from a performance perspective, as Narinder talked about, and then broaden it to the impact level, that there's really so many ways that we're underutilizing data in volunteer engagement. So I've always considered data to be an incredibly important tool in my toolbox.
Thank you, Erin. That was great to hear about your utilization of it within the profession, or where there are gaps within the profession around how data could be better integrated or used. And I also love that you referenced how you use it in your own personal practice or your own personal profession. And that notion of reflective practice is, I think, a key component to enabling us to do better data-informed practice and using data in our day-to-day work. What I was curious about after hearing some of those reflections, I'm curious from the panelists, what they think organizations need to consider in terms of readiness for data-driven engaged work. So what are some factors for organizational readiness that you have identified that are supportive to enable a data-informed approach or a data-engaged approach?
Megan, if you want, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
one of the biggest things that jumps to mind immediately is during the pandemic, one of the biggest barriers was beside the lockdown was the fact that we actually didn't have a lot of contact information and data on volunteers. So we couldn't actually even contact volunteers to give them updates, to give, because either, software wasn't cloud-based or right. So it was very basically, we didn't have emails, we didn't have phone numbers, we didn't have cloud-based tools to access the information. And so if there's not that infrastructure, which you alluded to earlier, then there's really there's nowhere to go in this day and age.
Yeah, great. And any other, oh, Narinder, I think you're going to jump in.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce that the infrastructure part is so critical, and the ability for us to see the infrastructure as an enabler of efficiency, of effectiveness, of impact, and not as a cost and not as a burden. And it's like that shift in mindset of these are, with the right infrastructure, the right tools, you'll be able to collect the right type of data. You'll be able to understand and leverage the right type of data, and kind of thinking as part of the program versus as an adjacency to the programs and the work that we're doing is so critical.
Awesome. Thank you, Narinder, for that. And any comments from yourself, Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kinds of challenges that we face are a little bit different because we produce what's often known as thick data, small data, primarily qualitative data. And it's rich in detail and context specific. Rather than generalizable big data. And often our partners, they've never worked with it before, and they're not sure always how to use it in a way that feels authoritative to them. They're not used to using stories as data, and we find them really, really powerful. But in certain institutional settings, it's not, there's not the mechanisms or the formats for using that kind of data to inform decisions.
Great, thanks, Natalie, for that. And I love there's a conversation here that's flowing across all the panelists around access to data, but also access to diverse stories, to viewpoints, to perspectives that are going to inform really advancing collective and collaborative change. We're going to switch to the next question because I know we've got another great question here. And that's how did you apply a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens when considering data to your work? So this was a nice little segue here to this next conversation. And Narinder, I think we're going to kick this conversation off with insights from yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep it fairly broad because of the different types of work that I'm engaged in right now. But, doing this is so important for so many reasons. And I think most folks would align. But I think a lot about how we minimize the risk of reinforcing existing inequalities as a function of the necessity to do and to kind of integrate this work at the onset into any type of data collection work, systems work, infrastructure work. So I'll share kind of just a few kind of areas. The first is data collection and representation. So, how do we examine how data is collected and represented? How do we ensure that data collection methods are inclusive and don't continue to reinforce existing biases? Do we consider whether data captures experiences and needs of diverse populations, including those that have been historically left out? How do we think about reciprocity and thinking about how do we compensate those who share data with us? Is there a way in which we're providing some value in return? So much data is collected from so many people, and they will never see or understand the use case of that data. So how do we think about whether it's recognition, value add, compensation in terms of the collection process? The other piece, which is really important when we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, is intersectionality. And, you know, in particular in Canada, in kind of the rich diversity that exists across our country, recognizing that there is intersectionality of social identities. A lot of the data sets that I see collected do not integrate this in ways in which are enabling to get to deeper insights of what is happening, of inequalities, of opportunities. And so understanding that individuals may belong to multiple different groups and their experience may differ significantly. So analyzing that data with an intersectional perspective is just such a critical part of embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in any type of data work. Another is, you know, I mentioned this earlier, but bias mitigation. So how do you implement strategies to mitigate bias in data collection? And to do that, you need to be aware of the inherent biases that exist in data sources and in algorithms. And then how do you adjust those interpretations to avoid these biases and perpetuate reinforcing existing stereotypes or discrimination that does exist and has, you know, many, many cases of data being used for harm on communities that are historically underfunded, overlooked, historically left out of systems. And the final piece I'll touch on is community engagement. So, you know, who are we involving? Who are the communities? Who are the stakeholders affected by our work? What is their input into the process? What is their ownership into the process? Whether that's from data collection, analysis, decision-making processes, how do we center their voices and experiences to ensure that the data that we are collecting addresses their needs and concerns? And then going back to, you know, if we are collecting data, how do we make that data available to the communities we've collected on? And how do we kind of ensure that respect and that transparency in what is being collected? And so, you know, I could continue on this one because this is an area that I deeply believe on, but I'll pause there and just, you know, I think the opportunity for this is so critical and it has to start at design at the initial stages. And this, I think that the challenge I often see when people think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's an afterthought or it's kind of later in the process. And at that point, the design, the collection, the approaches have been set. And there is a higher probability that you're creating or reinforcing existing biases or creating potential harm to communities that, again, historically have been excluded in different ways.
Thank you, Narinder, for that that reminder about thinking about these important ways to include diverse perspectives at the beginning of the conversation, not at the midway point or only at the end, and that really designing with those who are going to be beneficiaries of any kind of data approach is critical to really thinking and recentering data work from an equity informed perspective. And there's a lot of work, I think. I know organizationally, we're all really reflecting on how we can do this, not just in thoughts, but actually in the doing of the work. And so thinking about that in the data doing is really critical as well. Erin, what about you? What are your insights into this question?
Well, Narinder raised so many good points, you know, and for me, you know, just to reinforce one of her points, I mean, data is just binary. It's ones and zeros. So it's really the meaning and context we apply. And for me, what I thought about, which is certainly not unique to volunteer engagement, but I think is an important point, is that, you know, volunteering itself. So if we're thinking about data on volunteers, we already know that there are socioeconomic, educational, and other privileges that are connected to volunteering and who's volunteering. We also know that there are cultural lenses and understandings, you know, when we talk about the word volunteering. And so, you know, there's a lot of that. We also think about the DEI lens of when we engage volunteers, so that it's not coming from a place of pity and power, but coming from a very community-centered lens of dignity and respect. And my colleague from the US, Brianna Dorlis, does amazing work around this with her company Connecting the Cause. The other point that I thought was important to raise was through some research that has been done through Toby Johnson and Volunteer Pro, it's you just have to kind of look around a room at a VMPC meeting, but we know that the overwhelming majority of volunteer engagement professionals are white. They're middle class, educated women, and I am a representation of that, and so. There is very much an important lens we have to apply to be critical, to be reflective, so that we are not doing, the unintended harm to communities, that we are not reinforcing power dynamics through the work that we engage volunteers in. And that we're not doing, creating exploitive volunteer roles. So one example is, which Narinder briefly touched on, is people sharing their stories, but for many years, it was often done in a very exploitive kind of way. And then the final point I thought to share was just, if we look at the National Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and Participating, it offers breakdowns, through geography and age, but really not fully in ways that would provide data to support leaders of volunteers, to better understand volunteer patterns of members of the community we know are underrepresented, and to really help us make volunteerism as inclusive as possible. So those were just a few additional points above the great ones that Narinder shared that I thought might be helpful.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks for the reference to some other pieces of research here as well that can help advance the conversation. Natalie, over to you.
Hi. So yeah, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, a lot of data, even about how to address injustice, well-being, inclusiveness, inequality, or other wicked problems in community, don't have good data from people most directly and negatively affected by current systems. And instead, they're often represented by organizations that serve them, but have their own distinct set of interests and perspectives, or asked to express themselves, as Erin mentioned, through frameworks and concepts that are not of their own choosing. So we actually focus our research on the extreme ends of the bell curve, based on a design principle that what works for the extremes will often work for the middle, but rarely the reverse. So some of the practices that we use to engage people on the margins include going to people where they're at. We do research with people in malls, bingo halls, their homes, wherever they may be and where they may be comfortable. We try to consider what would make participation meaningful, even delightful for different people. And we create warm and inviting spaces, pop-ups with free fancy coffees, plant giveaways, nostalgic snack stands, or of course we offer honoraria. We try to be accountable to participants by following up with them, trying to see how did the interaction leave them, returning ethnographic stories when that's the kind of research we're doing, and asking people how they want to be known, how else they would like to be involved or heard more broadly, and advocating for their preferred forms of participation. And we also design quite high touch interactions. So we tend to avoid surveys, forms, and fixed questions in favor of deep listening, shadowing people on their daily activities, having meals together, and inviting people into optional activities to learn about their perspective. Activities are sometimes fun and reflective, open to creativity, gamified sometimes. And our goal is to help people feel seen and heard rather than making a transactional request for info. So we create many ways to participate using visual or verbal prompts in addition to written, noticing people's preferred language, whether that's verbal or body language, and using it in preference to system language. And depending on timing, I can speak later to our 10 years of experience alongside adults with developmental disabilities to co-create supports for more flourishing and connected lives in community. That ongoing research has pushed us to develop such a broad range of ways to engage people who may or may not be verbal or literate and express themselves in a beautiful variety of ways. And that research has fueled the development of a platform called Currico, currently scaling in BC. But I want to start I want to share an example of a prototype that we came to through work with Recover, the City of Edmonton's Urban Wellbeing Initiative, and REACH, Edmonton's Safety Council. After developing a new framework for well-being based on ethnographic research with 60 street-involved Edmontonians, we realized that cities had no data about this concept of well-being, which was based in the idea of connectedness. And whereas ethnographic research takes experience and intensive time commitment and can be more costly for the size of the data set, Oracle is, it offers a sort of a middle way between that very rich ethnographic data and the sorts of public consultations and citizen engagements that can increase polarization or close off space for nuance and offer little room for reflection. If I have time, I could show a couple of pictures from that.
Thanks, Natalie. Those are great. That's a great example or a great snapshot of the ways in which you've shifted some of the practices or brought ideas or concepts and new ways of doing to the forefront. And especially listening to those that are going to be most impacted by a change or a way of thinking about an issue. The other thing I'm really mindful about in folks' responses here to this question is this notion of capacity. And it also requires organizational capacity to really lean in and do this in good ways organizationally, but also in communities. So thinking about how data is used, collected, accessed, that it's often, if we rethink this question a little bit and imagine how capacity can be built in communities who are facing barriers to access or inclusion, building capacity from a community-based approach might shift how we think about data over the longer term. So thank you for those really great answers and reflections on this question around how to think about equity and inclusion in the data space. So we wanted to just also ask a question about civic participation, broadly speaking. And one of the things we've been curious a little bit about as we think about volunteerism at Volunteer Canada is just this question of what data sets are available and where can we find meaningful data sets, and whether or not we're having sufficient data sets to speak to the nuances that are happening in communities. And so I'm curious about the reflections on this question from you, Erin.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to say not really, but that's my own bias of always wanting more data and more research because I love it. So, but I would say, you know, when we talk about civic engagement with volunteerism being, you know, kind of one of the pillars of it, I'm still seeing a lot of siloing and not enough connecting of the dots. So, for example, you know, there is some data that, you know, shows correlations and connections between volunteering and donating, that volunteers are more likely to donate, they're more likely to donate more. But I've never seen, and this could be my own, you know, missing of this, but I've never seen any data that proves or disproves a connection to other forms of civic participation. And, you know, and it just seems to me, you know, that there must be something there. Years ago, I commented that volunteering is very much the canary in the coal mine in organizations. So if you're seeing declines in volunteerism in your organization, in volunteer engagement in your organization, you're likely either already or soon to see changes in other forms of some support. And so if I take that kind of concept and apply it on a macro level, it just seems incongruous to me that we wouldn't see the current declines in volunteerism in our country, and that they're not somehow connected to other declines in civic participation, like voter turnout, you know, and you know, trust in public institutions. Beyond that, just, you know, speaking about those kind of like aggregate volunteer data, is, you know, we're also not seeing benchmarks. You know, things like, you know, if we know that this percent of, you know, people, you know, apply to volunteer, how many of them are actually, you know, following through? So we sometimes get, I think, data that is too high level and not enough about, you know, the kind of meat of what we're looking at, and being able to connect, you know, if we think about like intention to volunteer, or people, you know, people in intention to donate, or, you know, to go out and vote, like what are those connections of all of those different actual behaviors, and what are those, you know, where is that causal if there is a causal relationship, does volunteerism drive these things? Does voting drive these things? What are those connection points? Because I think that's really important from a volunteer recruitment point of view, from a volunteer engagement point of view, and obviously for the other panelists, things like donating, and things like that. So hopefully that was coherent, but I would say we don't have enough, and we don't have enough to really connect the dots.
Thank you, Erin. Natalie, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need some different kinds of data, and we need data that's not just a means to an end. If we value civic participation, if we value connected communities, we should be designing research that boosts civic participation and sense of connectedness. And if you will allow me to share my screen, I'll just show an example of what I mean by that.
I'm not sure how easily we can do that in this format. Natalie, it's a challenge, but we can do that behind the scenes, maybe. If you want to share a picture, we could get you to send that over we can do that through the back end if you can, and you can send it to Shaminda maybe, and we'll get that up on the screen if we have time.
Maybe I'll just describe.
Sure, describe. That's great.
Okay, so we have a prototype called Oracle, which is an advanced prototype that offers a novel way for cities or other communities to boost, to both measure and strengthen well-being and sense of connectedness. And it consists of a new role for residents as researchers, and they're trained to gather stories from fellow community members, and supported to reach out to people who might be quite different from them. And we have a tool that collects and interprets what are essentially microethnographic stories. So people just telling a story about a moment that mattered to them and that affected their well-being. And we make that a publicly accessible dashboard. So anyone can access that research, talk about that research together without us. And we use creative ways to engage people who are often left out of surveys and focus groups. Our last round of this was in transit. And so we had, fireside chats outside of transit with people. We had these residents we trained up called local listeners dressed up in costumes or running pop-up stalls to try and spark the interest of transit riders, and lots of different ideas that they tested to see if it could bring people in to chat about their experiences on transit. And we also hold a public festival and an engagement process for making sense of and collectively acting on that data at the end. And we call it Nosy Fest, where you can get nosy about how the people around you are actually doing. It's like a carnival of research. We have performances to encourage people to stop in when they're in transit spaces. We have pattern finding that people do in stories, reading and listening to stories that their fellow transit riders have offered up. And then we hosted stranger picnics where people could talk to each other about what they were reading and hearing. So it's very much a community building moment around research and data that makes that research and data more meaningful. And I think at the end of all of these processes, we feel quite confident that, we have more people who'll be willing to volunteer around questions of transit safety and well-being, because people are really engaged in a different way that you aren't when you're just responding to a survey.
Thank you for that great example. And I love the concreteness of that Oracle example, but also how you're making data and the process of imagining data and thinking about data and looking at data much more playful and creative and fun, which then enables people's curiosity on the overall topic of data. Because sometimes data, when you hear data, I sometimes put up a wall and think, oh, I can't go there kind of thing. So I love the way you're inviting curiosity on that topic also.
I'll just share one quick thought. So I agree with everything Erin and Natalie were saying, and I love the example Natalie shared. And I think what Erin was saying, like the kind of short answer is like, no, like there isn't enough data. The data doesn't connect, it doesn't aggregate, it's not longitudinal. There's a lot of challenges, or if it is, you can't really pure data sets. But the one thing I'll just highlight on is the definition of what civic participation does change over time and does change for different generations. So, I'll give you the proxy of giving, like donating is down but for youth, right? But their mental accounting of doing good is very different than the generation before theirs of their mental accounting of doing good. Because that used to be, let's donate to a charity. And that was like a very finite way, and volunteer and other elements as well. But that was, there was a set of finite ways, and that has substantially changed for this next generation. And I think in the same way, civic participation looks different. And I don't know if our ability to collect or what we are collecting is keeping up with the changes in which different people show up in civic participation. And that's such a critical element if we want to get the quality data to be able to understand these insights and to be able to connect the dots of how we further kind of build stronger communities through civic participation.
Thank you, Narinder, for those great insights, because you're reminding me also about the constructs by which we think about some of these concepts to begin with, like what giving meant 30 years ago isn't what giving means today, and that is informed by the context in which we live, and all sorts of various our intersectional identities and all of these kind of factors that are changing how we think about some of these concepts in our communities. So thank you for that reminder. And the generational piece also is key, right? So where you're from, your background, what generation, like where you sit on a generational piece is all critical questions to think about in terms of how to think about these. Yeah.
And I imagine a lot of folks feel tweeting is an act of civic participation. And I don't know if we're ever looking at that or collecting that or viewing that in the same way as we do other types of civic participation.
Yeah, that's a really great provocative question. Like how do we actually define these terms, and what are we, the definition can drive the data as well, right? Like the ways we think about the concept. And I'm sorry that I was just kind of moving through and kind of going along, and I forgot to turn to you, Narinder, because I was getting excited about the conversation we were having. So thank you for the reminder, Shaminda, behind the scenes. And so if folks do have a question, put it into the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen. We would love to hear your questions. We have time at the end. Our panelists are really gracious and offering their insights and their examples. And what I loved about their conversation is they were giving really great, concrete, practical examples from all sorts of different perspectives. So a big thank you to our very talented panelists who I know are not leaving us. They're going to provide us with more answers to our curious questions as we move forward. But without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor over to Shaminda Pereira, who has done an exceptional job in moving this project forward. And he's going to give us a great demo to this new resource, or a revised resource that we're all seeing here today. So over to you, Shaminda.
Thank you, Messi, Megan. Hello, bonjour, everyone. I'm Shaminda, the Knowledge Practice and Learning Lead at Volunteer Canada, and I come to you from Port Credit, Mississauga, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So up to now, we heard how a data-informed and evidence-based practice can really benefit the sector. Now let's look at how to access the data relevant to giving and volunteering. Introducing the Canadian Knowledge Hub for Giving and Volunteering. Our vision for this data hub is for it to be a valuable resource for everyone who's looking for data related to giving and volunteering in Canada. Whether you're looking to develop, improve, or redesign your community programs and services, volunteer engagement strategies, diversified fund development strategies, your cases for support, funding applications, to name a few. I will now walk you through the data hub, so please bear with me as I switch to the live site. You can access the site by typing in to the web address givingandvolunteering.ca for the English version and donnebenevola.ca for the French version of the data hub. First, let's look at the main elements of the site, and then we will dive into the different site features. Right at the top and going across the screen is the blue color notifications and alerts bar. You can see it in action where from now and until end of March, we will have the invitation for you to participate in the public consultation on the 2026 Census of Population Dissemination. We encourage you to give your voice to this survey. Simply click on the orange button labeled Visit the Survey. Speaking of buttons, all buttons and actionable links will appear in orange color right throughout the site. If we explore the vertical structure of the page, the header is the site title and navigations bar where the main menu is housed. The menu is a sticky menu. This means it will be accessible at all times, even if you scroll through the page. Then we have the content body of the page following below that. And the page ends with the footer where the partner logos are displayed and along with additional information. So that is the structure of the page. Now to explore the menu options. There are 4 menu options. If any of them have submenus, it will be indicated with a black color downward arrow. First in line is the home menu to bring you back to the home page from where you are on the site. Second from the left is the explore the data menu. Here you will have access to 5 data products, which we will go through in a few minutes. Next menu option is resources, where you will find resources related to data literacy and other local, national, and global reports on civic participation. The last menu option is the option to switch between the English and French language versions of the Data Hub. Now let's look at the Explore the Data menu. It has submenus dedicated to each data initiative we have connected with this Data Hub. The General Social Survey on Giving, Volunteering, and Participating is first in line. The Satellite Account for Not-for-Profit and Voluntary Institutions is next in line. This dataset provides insights into the size, scope, and composition of nonprofit organizations. And then planned as a summer release, which is not yet active at the moment, are insights from the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. This provides a snapshot of the state of the not-for-profit organizations. Now, in these 3 menus, you will have access to the data stories and not the raw data tables. This makes it easy for you anyway, since we have sifted through the data tables and compiled them into data stories with visualizations. Then the last 2, the other 2 data sets are the grants and contributions data from the Open Government Portal. This database provides information on the grants and contributions awarded by the Government of Canada to various recipients. The next is the T3010 data. This can be used to gain insights for fund development decision-making, research and analysis, and policy development. Now, with these 2 data sets, we have provided access to the data source itself, since the interactivity of the data is available through the data source. Now to explore the data stories, let's take the General Social Survey on Giving and Volunteering as an example. In this page, you can see right at the beginning of the page the buttons to go directly into the data stories, if you're familiar with the data sets. Or you can browse through the page to learn more about this data set. And the page follows through to the list of data stories. So when you click on these 2 buttons, you're being brought down to the data stories over here. We do our best to group the data stories according to the meaningful categories where applicable. In this example, we can see that the GSS-GVP data stories are categorized as giving, volunteering by organization type, and by demographic. This structure of the data pages is a template we have right throughout the data, explore the data menu options. So you have the buttons to get directly into the data sets. Then you have a little bit of information on what this data set is all about and how you can use it. Then the actual links to the data stories. So this structure continues right throughout the page. So let's click on one of these stories now. So I clicked on the category giving and who donates and how much do they give. When you click on the data story link, you will be taken to the data story page directly. But right at the top of the page, you can see the features to filter based on geography, which I'm going to demonstrate a little bit now. So when you come into this page, you will see, Canada-wide, but then you can go into the different geographies. So if you look at, I just selected BC for British Columbia, and you can see the visualizations change to reflect the data based on the geography that you selected. And going to the structure of this page of how the data story appears, we have the visualizations along with the story behind the data. And there are many, we have tried to bring in as much visualizations as possible so that you have a good understanding of the story behind it. And the home button will bring you back to the engagement site. Now let's explore the resources menu. Here we have packed resources related to data literacy and other reports on civic participation. If you go through the submenu, you have first up data literacy resources, meaning understanding how to use data. The next is blog, relevant to data utilization in giving and volunteerism. And then we have share your stories, which is also a feature planned for summer as a summer release. This is an asynchronous discussion forum for peer-to-peer discussions related to data in the sector. Then through the share your data needs page, you can let us know what types of data you're looking for. It would help us to identify what data that you're looking out for and to see whether it's possible for us to find it and source it and include it in the data hub, or to build relationships with those data initiatives based on the recurring themes of data needs. Then we have a section of reports that will link to local, national, and global reports on giving and volunteering. And I just clicked on that, and you can see it's again categorized into reports on volunteering, reports on giving, and sector-wide reports. I'm going to click on reports on volunteering. And you can see we have a couple of reports already housed in here. So what we hope to do is to, whenever there's a local report coming up, maybe through a provincial not-for-profit association, or even sometimes volunteer centers, they themselves do studies based on the current times. And once these reports are published, and we will seek consent and have them uploaded onto the site over here. So it's not only about the raw data from the Statistics Canada or the CRA products, but also whatever is produced locally, we try to bring it up into this portal. Next up is infographics and other resources that will help you, with the supplementary material that you can download and use it. Whether you're going to use it in your funding proposals or as a discussion tool, or even if you want to make a pitch or design a new program, sometimes these infographics may serve as useful supplementary resources. As I mentioned before, our aim is for the Canadian Knowledge Hub for Giving and Volunteering to become a formidable tool in the sector for identifying trends and decision-making related to giving and volunteering. So we want to make sure that whatever resources we have and that we can find related to data and evidence-based decision-making, we will be bringing it up onto our portal. Well, that is the introduction to the Data Hub. If you would like us to come in front of your group or network or organization and share how it can be used for your specific audience, feel free to drop us a request at datadriven@volunteer.ca. I'm going to switch back to our presentation, so please bear with me while I do that.
There's a question here about a lack of data potentially in volunteer engagement. And so I'm just curious, maybe if for one of the panelists, if they want to reflect on what improvements could be made to enhance the practical implementation of data-driven strategies for volunteer engagement. That's a really great question. What could be done to improve practical implementation of data-driven strategies for volunteer engagement? Panelists, anyone want to jump in? Aaron, I'm wondering maybe if you do.
Oh, yes. How many hours do we have to answer this question, Megan? I would say, yeah, totally in agreement. Some of the key things that I think are important is, aggregate data and benchmarking data in volunteer engagement, right? I mean, if you're in marketing, that if you send out a survey, a 20 to 30%, survey response is a decent benchmark. If you're in fundraising, if you send a solicitation out, if you get 2%, donating or purchasing, that's a reasonable. We have no sense of those types of benchmarks in volunteer engagement, and I think that would be a really great place to start. And I'll just leave it there because otherwise I literally will not shut up.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then I'm curious, I know that there was a great question also that was great, a great response, Aaron. There was a question about compensation for data and thoughts on that. And I just wonder if either Narinder or Natalie want to jump in with anything kind of more publicly.
I think we're both typing an answer, so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I see that. We are both typing. Do you want to start, Natalie?
Okay, sure. Yeah, because we always do offer compensation, but we don't always lead with it. We do different things in different situations because money can reduce an interaction to a transaction. And it can exert pressure on someone to participate who would not otherwise like to. So we try and lead with more than just money as a reason you might want to engage with us. So, you know, even just starting with like a pop-up or, you know, a surprising and delightful engagement. Like we attract people to come to us by doing all kinds of silly things, including having had like a dance party at 5 a.m. outside of a shelter, and then asking people want a coffee. And then if people will show interest, we let them know this is a paid opportunity. We remunerate for your time. And other times we do lead with it if we think that that is a condition on which people can participate and otherwise they would not be able to. So we try to kind of respond to the context. Yeah.
Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah.
That's great. Some concrete examples. And what about you, Narinder?
Just to add, I think compensation for time and effort is absolutely an understandable ask. And I think driving collective knowledge for some is sufficient enough value and motivator. And if you're the designer of the research or the collector of the data, I think then that is an opportunity for you to map out how do you create the value that would incentivize and encourage uptake of the survey, and that will vary. But I do think that compensating for time is an appropriate approach when we're collecting data if there is no other value returned to the individual. And then if we could define and articulate the other value, then compensation may not be needed.
Thanks, Narinder. It's a good way to think of creatively around what's the value that will happen to the participant by their engagement or participation in that collection process or in a design process. Other questions here in the chat that I'm just going to flag. There was a question to the panelists about whether or not we could share back the research, and so we will do our best to follow up with the panelists and have any resources or research shared out in terms of some follow-up. We'll see what we can do there. And then there was a question about the Canadian Knowledge Hub and if we could filter it, and the answer is yes, where possible. You can filter it. And I would encourage folks to get into the site, play around with it, see what they can pull from the site where it's interesting. There's lots of really interesting, relevant data broken out by, you know, gender and demographic and some of the age, some of those pieces are some of the variables that are interesting to look at there. And other things there across geographies there, it's interesting as well. So take a look at the site and the data. And then the other thing I would flag is that if folks have an interest in having a more detailed walkthrough of the data or doing a more workshop style conversation around what the data is, ourselves at Volunteer Canada are very happy to come and facilitate a workshop on this data source and the resource in the Canadian Knowledge Hub for Giving and Volunteering. Because there is lots of really relevant and interesting data in there, and we're happy to facilitate a workshop that will help you imagine or think through how you could use that site in more detail. I just want to say as we wrap up, a huge thank you first of all to our panelists. You've really given us very concrete, practical examples of how to advance or use data to advance change and to think about that in inclusive ways that really are centered around equity and thinking about who's being included and excluded in data collection, data design processes, all of those pieces. So a huge thank you to our panelists for your participation and your expertise and your insights and putting up with me when I even skip over you because I'm so excited about the conversation. Sorry about that again, Narinder. But a huge thank you to Narinder, Natalie, and Aaron. You have been just tremendous guests and experts today in helping us really think about imaginative ways and really leading edge ways that we can think about how to integrate data into our practice and how it can really advance change and how we can do this collectively and collaboratively in ways that will make a difference in bigger impacts in our work. I also want to say a huge thank you to our project partners. We've been really working together on this important initiative over the last couple of years, and we have more time still to continue to roll this resource out and work together to advance this important piece of data infrastructure. So thank you to all of our partners who are here today to help inform this conversation and inform this project in really meaningful ways. Last but not least, as I'm wrapping up, we wanted to just remind people, give a shout out for the fact that National Volunteer Week this week is April 14th to the 20th. The theme is Every Moment Matters, and we're excited about that conversation as well. And we want to give a special thank you as I conclude to the Social Development Program within ESDC and the Government of Canada for their significant contribution of this important work. They have been a true partner in advancing this project and in helping us to think about how to disseminate the data in the GSS GVP. So we're happy to share the recording after today's conversation, and we will share the slides, and we will make sure that if we can, we share any resources that were referenced today. But most of all, I would encourage all of you to check out givingandvolunteering.ca. It's a great resource, lots of great information there and ways that you can, if you have feedback on the site, please make sure you reach out and share it with us as well. So without further ado, thank you all for your time today. We will be following up with more information, more webinars, more outreach, and more discussion around this important resource and how to think about data as we move forward in terms of data-driven engagement and giving, volunteering, and participation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Au revoir. Merci. À bientôt.